Curse of Strahd, Part 2, Chapter 2, The Lands of Barovia. This particular chapter, like the one before it, details the early sections of the campaign for Curse of Strahd. It is not a traditional adventure, although there are encounters present in this chapter. In the latter chapters, I'll detail each individual adventure, including the Death House, as we go on with this review series. Now, as you go into this chapter, you get basic campaign information for running Curse of Strahd. You also get the area map, and this is the DM's map, which includes where all the major settlements are, such as the village of Barovia, Castle Ravenloft, the ruined village, which I believe is this one right down here. You also get Kresk, another small village, and the main town of Vallaki, plus a lot of other locales scattered around Barovia itself. Now, it should be noted that Barovia is a very, very small land. You can generally travel from the village of Barovia all the way to Vallaki and maybe all the way to Kresk from morning to sundown, especially if you take the road. It's quite small, in fact, and many DMs find this as they're starting to play Curse of Strahd and are, well, surprised. Much like Rime of the Frost Maiden, it's in a very small area. Some people have even described it as not a sandbox, but a shadow box or a mist box, as the land is surrounded by the mists of Ravenloft. Now, as we go into the adventure, you get the general lay of the land, how things work in Barovia. This includes information on the actual mists of Ravenloft. Essentially, the mists bring people to Barovia and other domains of dread and prevent them from leaving unless they are certain individuals, or, say, Strahd is killed, which allows people to leave. Note the Vistani, who I'll talk about later, are free to come and go as they wish. Otherwise, no one can leave Barovia, not even with a wish spell, because the dark powers won't allow it. It is up to you as a DM to allow player characters, once they've completed the module, to return to wherever they came from, or perhaps, although they may be able to leave Barovia itself, they may simply end up in another domain of dread. Now, it is notable here in the adventure that sunlight is present in Barovia, although it's dimmed, at least somewhat. Perhaps the sun might be shining, but there's still some bit of cloud in front of the sun, and the vampires of Barovia, including Strahd, can actually go out in the daylight as a result, although they're still affected by, say, a sunblade or the daylight spell. There are some alterations with magic as well. These are mostly minor changes. For example, you cast Find Familiar, you're going to get an undead version of that familiar. You cast Find the Path, you're going to get a child who can't speak who's going to guide you down a path. Gust of Wind, you'll hear ghastly moaning accompanied by the wind. Mage Hand will be a skeletal hand. Mostly cosmetic changes that add to the general feel of Barovia itself as a dark, fallen land that is slowly falling more and more into despair. There's also some information if characters, well, for one thing, if you get revivified, you wake up screaming. But if characters who have been dead in Barovia for over 24 hours basically come back with some indefinite madness. Now, this does have a table right here in the 5e Tools version of it, but if you're using the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, I don't believe it actually has the madness tables in it, but you can use the madness table either from here or from the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. Some of these madness conditions can be very devastating, by the way, so the DM might want to roll one or two of them and maybe even let the player pick which madness they choose, such as if they become catatonic or something. Now, it also talks about the Barovians themselves. These are the people of Barovia who 9 out of 10 of them are essentially soulless shells. People with literally who are born without souls, who don't laugh, who don't cry. They're super introverted, they're unfriendly, they really are just sort of there mimicking human behavior. They can have children, and sometimes those children have actual souls. Occasionally, people who have souls are reincarnated in Barovia, which the adventure notes is part of the overall plot of what's happening in Curse of Strahd, with Strahd seeking the love of his life, Tatiana, who was lost to him, who has been reincarnated, of course. Now, you'll note just different members of what these people might look like. Most of the people of Barovia are human, and they're not used to seeing quote unquote demi humans like elves and dwarves. There are some dusk elves that live in Vallaki. They are used to seeing the Vistani people, or the Vistana, if you're singular. And the Vistani are human, however, it should be noted, they're just a different cultural group. And as I'll go into it later, they are the only people that can freely go back and forth. Although you'll argue, or I could argue, that they can bring people back and forth as well into various realms and all that. Now, that doesn't mean there are no dwarves or halflings within Barovia. There might be one or two. They may be people who were brought into Barovia at some other time that just kind of live in the village. They might even be people without souls themselves. It really just depends on how you want to flavor your campaign. But such species are not very common in Barovia, and if they are encountered, they will be very notable, most likely. Now, you do get the Barovian names, male and female names. You get the family names, which, again, these are great tables for putting together random NPCs and just, having a real nice theme for the land of Barovia and how things work. You get information on the souls and those who have them, and the shells of, well, people who have no souls, which are quite common, and some information on Irina. Irina, again, is a reincarnated version of Tatiana, who, if you if you listen to my prior video, has to do with why Strahd is seeking her, is because she's been reincarnated from Tatiana. Tatiana jumped off the banisters, or off the railing off from Castle Ravenloft to her death, and Strahd was then destroyed in his physical form and more or less came back as a vampire at that point, which took place hundreds of years ago. There is some minor information on what the common people know about Strahd himself, or the Devil Strahd, or what they know about the lands of Barovia. Some of the people who have souls might actually know about the other lands that border Barovia itself. It does not point out in the module that there are other domains of dread, and if you look up some information from older editions, you will find that Barovia does have several lands bordering it on all sides, and they are kind of interesting lands on their own. And there is some information on some of those lands in some other products that have come out, other books that have come out in fifth edition, which allow you as a DM to kind of explore some of these other domains of dread. But some people can also come in from those domains of dread, and a few people might even know about these lands existing, or maybe that the before the mists came and got so dense, people could go back and forth to those lands, but no longer. It's also notable that although Curse of Strahd depicts Barovia as this one area over here, the older editions of Barovia actually had it expand to the south, and I believe a little bit to the west. And there are other settlements in Barovia proper. Now, for this campaign, they wanted to limit things, so this is all you get. But there were other towns. I believe they were south of Mount Gaucus, and you can look them up online if you want to extend your campaign. And if you just want to extend the campaign, like what lies over to the old Slovak Road? Well, there is another land over there. There was actually a city that's not far off the map, but again, it's not reachable by road with the mist in place. Just like the road to the east side does lead to another domain. I think it's actually Vesa is the name of that domain. And if you go south of Barovia, there are those other quote unquote Barovian towns or areas that become part of Barovia. And there's actually two or three lands to the south that are not very big either, and one big land to the north. But I won't go into detail about them. You can look them up on your own if you'd like to include information about them. Now, there are the beliefs and superstitions of the various people of Barovia and what they believe in. They mostly believe in two gods. One is the Morning Lord, who is kind of like Lathander if you're using Forgotten Realms, but he's kind of vaguely like Lathander. He no longer answers people's prayers, although he will answer the prayers of priests and, or at least grant spells to priests. And then there is Mother Night, who could be thought of as Shar or a similar god or goddess of darkness, and is a good, version or a good parallel to what Shar is. If you're connecting your campaign to Faerun, you could, of course, use a different campaign setting and connect it to Eberron or connect it to Greyhawk or your own campaign setting. They're meant to be rather vague, but there are other gods as well connected to Ravenloft that are interesting, including, briefly I'll mention them. Ezra, for example, is the god of the mists. There may be, you could add a priest of Ezra who maybe is there preaching about the myths and how to respect them and give offerings to the myths. There's also I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there's a god who's similar to Bane, who is kind of just a tyrant god, and a number of others that are present in the different lands of the domains of dread, who might have a presence here as well. But the main two are the Morning Lord and Mother Night that the Barovian people worship. It's possible the Vistani might actually worship Ezra because they respect the myths and can come back and forth. Now, the Vistani themselves are wanderers traveling around with horse drawn, barrel topped wagons. I mean, they're clearly based on the Romani people on Earth. They have done a lot of changes with the Vistani to make them, just more palatable and to not have a bunch of racial stereotypes connected to the Romani people, but they basically are very similar. They do have their own culture, which differs from the Barovians, and unlike the Barovians, they have souls. All of them do. And the Barovians are very introverted and unfriendly for a variety of reasons. The Vistani are very colorful and musical, and they dance, and they are an important part of the campaign. They also act as silversmiths, coppersmiths, haberdashers, that's usually hat makers, cooks, weavers, musicians, entertainers, storytellers, toolmakers, horse traders. They should be encountered fairly often, and you can have people, your player characters, encountering them just on the road or random camps, or whenever they're going into town, they might encounter a few Vistani who are basically just tradesmen or who might be very useful to get information from. It's also a great group of individuals to spread rumors from, whether true or false. The player characters might, for example, hear that there's some terrible thing in the woods to the southeast of the Slavic woods when there's nothing actually out there, and when the player characters go out there, all they have to deal with is werewolves or random encounters, or maybe they find some old ruin, but there's nothing there, or maybe the Vistani just tell them a rumor about something that's out near Luna Lake, and maybe there's absolutely nothing there. Or maybe they tell them the truth, like such as all these locations marked M. That's all connected to a mad wizard who is roaming around this area. But it's a great bit of information to be able to give out and to use the Vistani for such purposes. They're also the servants of Strahd. Now, that doesn't mean all of them are. It may be just the majority of them here in Barovia. Again, with their wagons, they can come and go, and it's a good chance the player characters might have actually been brought to Barovia by the Vistani. They could, in theory, and I've used this in my campaign, take people away from Barovia if they wish, with the implication that they will return, and the Mists will return anyone who leaves, perhaps. You get their lore, what they know about Strahd, what they know about the lands of Barovia, their beliefs and superstitions, and very specifically, the fact that some of them can basically tell the future, which does come into play in this chapter of the adventure. This has to do with the Jaroka deck, which the DM should have drawn cards from earlier. The Vistani also have curses. Now, this is connected to some stereotypes about the Romani people, but the D&D in 5th edition, they're trying to use these ideas without making them seem completely harmful and say that this is something the Vistani can do, but there is a consequence for them doing it, so they're very hesitant to do it. For example, a Vistani can give a curse if you disrespect them or treat them poorly, but if the curse is ended, they will take psychic damage and it could kill them. If they give the player characters a really bad curse, like preventing them from being able to attune to a magic item, it can do a lot more damage to them. Or the Vistani could blind them if, say, one of the player characters blatantly just attacks them. I like this because it makes this curse of the Vistani something that's more defensive and something they would be reluctant to use and use maybe as a last resort, or say only if the player characters actually physically harm them would they do such a thing. There are consequences for the Vistani doing things like this. They also have an ability called Evil Eye. Again, this kind of connects back to some harmful stereotypes, which you can look into if you want. It's something they can do, and basically acts like a number of different spells. But if they use it incorrectly, they can be blinded by it, for at least briefly. It's interesting that they have these abilities. If you, as a DM, don't want to include these abilities with the Vistani, you do not have to. I didn't use them in my campaign, although they could be interesting in the right circumstances, such as, again, if the player characters come in and disrespect the Vistani, having the Vistani curses and Evil Eye might actually be really useful in that case, and you might want to consider using them in certain cases. Now, this chapter also includes a random encounter table, which you'll note there's scarecrows, there's a revenant, there's wolves, berserkers, Vistani bandits, because some of the Vistani are bandits. Not all of them are, and it shouldn't be thought of that all Vistani are some sort of schemers. Some of them might be there to help the player characters to some degree. There's some twig blights, druids. Note that these druids are not friendly. Most of these random encounters are not really that random. They have to do with different segments of the campaign as the player characters are going around the adventure. For example, Y is a Golteus tree, which, when the adventure was produced, the Golteus tree wasn't a monster, it was more just a tree, and the twig blights came from it. It is now an actual monster, so the DM has the option of using the Golteus tree as a very dangerous threat. I would recommend, if the player characters go there and they want to attack the tree, make the tree attack back and make it seem dangerous. I mean, for a low level group, a Golteus tree is a deadly, deadly fight. It might even be a challenge for a higher level group. Now, as you're going through these different encounters, some of these encounters, like wolves and dire wolves, the player characters might encounter them, well, at early level, and they might be pretty dangerous. But some of these encounters are going to be pretty easy at higher level, and your player characters are going to get higher level at some point. The Revenant at low level is pretty dangerous considering how much it's worth. You might want to consider every time the player characters encounter, say, individuals on here, like they encounter werewolves in human form here, or maybe if they kill the druid and the twig blights, replace that with something else on your random encounter table, something a little more dangerous that fits the setting. It could be really anything that works, like maybe replace it with a random wraith. If the player characters find a grave, maybe replace that with something else that they might encounter later. If they encounter, a random trinket, put something else in, like a lost backpack with some interesting things in it. If they encounter the dire wolves, maybe the next encounter with dire wolves, there might be more of them. There might be 2d6 instead of 1d6. You could add the new dire warg in as an example. You could add specters in. There's a lot of new creatures. There's even creatures in the other uh, Ravenloft book that came out. It's like a campaign book. I mentioned it earlier. I don't remember the name of it at the top of my head, but just look it up online and you'll find it. It does have some additional creatures in it, and as well as things that could be from the other domains of dread. One of the domains of dread, if I remember correctly, is connected to sort of flesh golems a lot. So you could be like a wandering flesh golem coming from the southern lands that somehow cross into Barovia, or it could be another group of adventurers, like a duo of hostile adventurers that Strahd brought into Barovia, which are also going to be very violent and will not be friendly in any way, shape, or form. Or it could be a friendly adventurer who turns out to be something that they're not, like an adventurer who turns out to be a succubus or something else that reveals itself later. Now, there's also nighttime encounters. Note If the player characters are traveling at night, these encounters tend to be far more deadly and are more hostile in general. Barovia at night is not a happy place. It's very violent. If I remember correctly, my group refused outright to travel at night. They were terrified of the nights in Barovia, even at higher level. You get information on all these individuals, the Barovian commoners, who the berserkers are, random corpse the player characters might find, the dire wolves, um, all this stuff. And you can go into it in detail, but it just gives you some basic information for this chapter as you're encountering random things with your player characters. There are some rare were ravens, which are detailed in the adventure, which are connected to the Wizard of Wines section. A will-o-wisp encounter, for example. And then you get the actual map of Barovia. And again, the random encounters take place at random. You can roll for them according to the book, and then the player characters are also throughout the campaign eventually going to encounter these individual locations or likely will. The player's map does not have these little numbered sections here, so the player characters won't know that those things are there. These aren't necessarily hostile locations. Like O is the old windmill, and there's some hags there. The M location, again, is where the Mad Mage might be encountered. That's not the Mad Mage Hallister Blackcloak, by the way. He's a different mage that's lost here. But it might be locations like I is where the junction to the road going to Castle Ravenloft is, and there's a black carriage there. And F is just a crossroads. G is where the player characters might encounter the Vistani the first time, and they're not necessarily major locales, but they should be noted when the player characters get there. Such as B is the gates of Barovia, the ancient gates, which are missing these giant statues, missing their heads, and it does come with this awesome, image that I would share with your player characters as they arrive. Images like this, that the heads are on the ground. Images like this are great to help add to the sense of wonder and lore of the campaign. Now, you do get some other basic stuff, common features, secret doors, locks, webs, and all this stuff, and how you can use them and what their set DCs are. But unless it's set differently, you do get details on what happens if the player characters start entering the Slavich woods and things they might encounter. There might be some things that they just happen to find out there. I mean, location D is the River Ivlis, and there's not really much there. It should be described to the player characters. But I'll note as well, certain locations like E, the village of Barovia, is detailed specifically in the next chapter, chapter 3. There's several locations like that, such as Valaki, or if they go to Yester Hill or the Emperor Temple. These particular locations have their own chapter, but most of these minor locations are just a minor locale. The River Ivlis crossroads, there's a chance of a random encounter taking place there, and I'll note if you look on my Patreon, I do have a map of what you might find near this crossroads that you should be able to download for free, which includes the gallows and a bunch of the graves standing there. And there's other things that the player characters could encounter. One location I will note that is important for this campaign is the Seer Pool encampment. This is where the Vistani are first encountered, likely, unless you encounter them in Barovia Village. Madame Eva's tent is here, and essentially, Madame Eva is the fortune teller of these particular Vistani, who can read their Taroka deck, or use the Taroka deck to read their fortunes if the player characters want their fortunes read. Now, when the player characters get there, they will likely, if they get to location F, they may hear music down the road from that location, possibly at least, or they might not. It's up to the DM. Note that each little hex is a fourth of a mile. So from the crossroads to where the Vistani is, it's about a mile and a half or so out there. The player characters may not even hear them at that distance, especially with the woods in the way, but give them the option that there is a road heading out there. Otherwise, they might hit the long way, and they may hear the sound of music from the east carrying up to the valley from the other direction. The player characters don't have to go to this location at any particular time. It is interesting and it's a great role playing location when the player characters go there, or if they do. It's not necessarily that they do it in the beginning of the adventure. They could just avoid it if they don't know what's there, obviously. And then you get information about the Vistani telling their stories and everything. And it's a great role playing segment overall, and one of the best parts about Curse of Strahd, in my opinion. You get details on the falls, you get the black carriage that is essentially waiting there for someone, likely player character, to escort them or multiple members of their group up to Castle Ravenloft. You get the gates of Ravenloft as well, which again leads to the chapter on Castle Ravenloft, which I'll detail later as we're going into the campaign. And again, you get the Lake Zarevich and all these other locations. You get just different people that the player characters might encounter, like Bluto, Krogavov, a desolate drunkard who you could encounter at this location. You get the Mad Mage of Mount Baratov and who he is in more detail. Many of these, again, are potential role playing encounters, but the Mad Mage could be a hostile encounter. He's essentially a mad archmage who tried to fight and attack Strahd but failed and went insane. And he also could theoretically be an ally if the right card is drawn in the Taroka deck. Now, you get other locations. You get the Broken Manor here, which is hard to pronounce. It's Argin Holt, I believe, something like that. It's detailed in Chapter 7. The player characters can again go there. You get Kresk, you get the ruins of Berez, the sunken village. You get Van Richten's Tower, which is a very small location, the Wizard of Wines, Amber Temple, yada, 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 and the Werewolf Den and all that. All locations that the player characters can visit throughout this particular campaign and likely will at different times. It doesn't really matter when they go there. The player characters, they might be a group that says when they get to the Black Carriage that they see Castle Ravenloft and want to go straight to the castle. The DM, in my opinion, should give the player characters a sense of foreboding if they choose to do that early, but I wouldn't stop them from going there. It might be actually very interesting if the player characters go there, find it to be too dangerous, and have to flee and come back later. And encountering some of the creatures there, it might be incredibly dangerous if they go there. But it might be interesting if, say, your player characters want to go off in the woods for some reason, and I would suggest not stopping them. Let them find out what happens when they go off the road. That it's far more dangerous, and there are terrible things out there. Maybe if they go through these woods, they encounter shambling mounds, or you can use. I'm trying to remember what they're called. There is a corpse flowers are a great creature to put in the woods that are create undead, or they sort of reanimate corpses, and at low level they can be a dangerous threat if the player characters just wander off into the woods and don't stick to the road, which the townsfolk that they might encounter in Barovia or the Vistani might tell them to not go off the road. It's very dangerous. And again, the player characters might encounter locals traveling on the road, which likely would be Vestani, but it might be some armed commoners going from Valaki to Barovia. And if they are going there, there's got to be a good reason for it. Like they might be traders or something like that, or maybe people bringing wine from the Wizard of Wines location and to sell at the inn in Barovia. In any case, there would be reasons to encounter people on the road if they do encounter people on the road. Now, overall, part two of Curse of Strahd is a really good setup for the overall campaign. It's not a traditional adventure in the normal way and form, but it is definitely a place where different encounters can take place, and it's more or less the basis and foundation of the campaign for the overall Barovia world. And it's a really good setup overall. I believe if you ever play some of the other campaigns, such as Realm of the Frost Maiden, it has a very similar chapter to explain Lands of Icewind Dale, and it works really well in the same sense. But again, it's a very small land. It's if you can put it in, if you look at a lot of campaign settings, you can notice that one hex is usually a day's worth of travel. This would be the equivalent of 1 day's worth of travel. It just happened to be really zoomed in on as to everything that happens to be in Barovia, or at least this version of Barovia. Now, overall, I would rate this chapter of Curse of Strahd as a 5 out of 5. There is absolutely no flaws to this particular chapter, in my opinion. It has great information. It's a great setup for the entire campaign. I mean, I think my only possible critique is it would be nice if there were some other locations in the middle of these woods here or something like that. I did add some locations, and the DM could do that, but it's not even really a critique. It's just a nitpick. You could easily add things like that if you wanted to expand your campaign. In fact, there's some newer modules that have come out that you can easily stick into different areas of the middle of the forest that would tie in really well with Curse of Strahd. Now, guys, if you like these reviews, you want to see more of them, check out my other videos. Please like and subscribe. Check out my Patreon if you'd like, and stay tuned for more content.